This is part one of the introduction into computational neuroscience. Many neuroscience textbooks concentrate on the one hand on the details at the cellular level, so what happens at the synapse, how do you generate an action potential, how does a cell membrane potential change, second messengers, all these biochemical cascades, protein synthesis. All these are involved in processing information, and on the other hand they look at behavior. So from, for example, brain damage, can you tell what the hippocampus does, what the amygdala does, and so on. What I would like to discuss here is what happens in between. How can you connect up neurons, or at least simplified models of neurons, in order to produce behavior? And I start off with the barn owl. That is an animal that uses sound quite intensively to hunt, not by using echolocation. The barn owl just sits on a branch and listens for sound. If it hears anything that sounds like prey, it first turns the head to fixate the sound. Then if it hears it again, it attacks, and it's willing to do that even in complete darkness when it doesn't see anything, just flying in the direction of the sound. And barn owls have actually something quite neat, namely asymmetric ears. One ear points up, the other ear points a bit down. And for sounds with short enough wavelengths, that is wavelengths shorter than the size of the ear canal, so that the ear canal can actually produce sound shadows, and short wavelengths means high frequencies. That means the barn owl can, from the relative intensity in the two ears, tell something about the angle of the sound. So if the sound is a lot louder in the ear that is pointing up, then it must be coming up from some location relatively far up relative to head direction, and vice versa. That is such a useful thing that it actually has evolved 3 times separately in owls. There are some that have asymmetric skulls. There are some where the fleshy part of the ear canal is asymmetric, and there are some where the feathers do that job. Then the other piece of information owls use in order to tell where, as a first approximation, a sound is right versus left, or more precisely where the sound is relative to an axis that goes through the two ears. There the owls use time differences. So if a sound arrives first on the right ear, then presumably the sound is somewhere to your right. In order to use that, in order to be able to do that, of course, you need to capture some time-related information. And that happens right in the cochlea. So in the inner ear you've got the cochlea, and that is full of hair cells. They have cilia on the top, and when sound arrives in the ear, these cilia wave back and forth. And the way this is set up is such that if the cilia bend this way, then channels in the membrane open, potassium ions flow in, cause depolarization, neurotransmitter is released, and then you get an action potential. At least you have a high probability of an action potential here in the auditory nerve. When the cilia swing the other way, then those channels close and you don't get an action potential, which means that the action potentials are, their timing is related to when a sound wave arrives in the ear. So that's called phase locking. The action potentials are phase locked. Once you've got this timing information, then you need to analyze it somehow. And in birds, the way this seems to work is as follows. So here, sound wave arrives on the right ear. Let's say that makes the cilia bend this way. It triggers an action potential. The wavefront, though, if it's coming slightly from the right, it will need some time to arrive at the left ear. Now, a physicist could calculate that time delay from knowing the distance between the ears and the speed of sound and the angle, and of course measuring the time delay, knowing speed of sound and distance, can then also calculate the angle. The owl doesn't have that information, at least not explicitly. It generates a neural network, though, which still can tell the direction of sound. At least it can calibrate its estimates so that they fit to visual estimates of location, and so that they then can be calibrated to movements so that the barn owl is actually flying in the right direction and initially just fixating the correct spot. Once you have these action potential triggers, what happens next in the owls is that you get an action potential. So that initially goes through the auditory nerve. Then it arrives here in the brain at what is called a delay line. So a delay line has inputs from the right ear, from the left ear, and in between neurons that are coincidence detectors. They fire when they get input from both sides. So here we have sound arriving at the right ear, triggering an action potential. Then as the wavefront progresses, so that is the action potential along the delay line, then the sound arrives at the left ear. That triggers an action potential there. These move towards each other. When they meet, you get activity here. You have an activity patch. And the location of that activity patch tells you something about the direction of the sound source, because the earlier the sound arrives at the right ear, that is, the further the sound is towards the right, the more of a head start this action potential gets, and the further it moves along this delay line before it meets the one from the left side. And so the location of the activity patch tells you something about the angle. That principle of neural coding is called a labeled line. It matters which neurons fire, not how much, but which neurons. That is one of at least 4 different neural codes. I'll mention briefly later on the frequency code. So these are the most basic codes that have been known for quite some time. There is also a phase code, and there is what's called a modulo code that has been, well, at least that is a hypothesis for explaining how the grid cells in the entorhinal cortex work, and potentially also how intervals might be timed. Anyway, let's return here to the barn owl's delay line. So these action potentials meet, then they separate, and you get here to this. I have written a program which models this. So here you see the action potentials arriving simultaneously from the right and the left. If I now let the sound move a little bit to the right, then you should see that this activity patch, each time I move this, the sound a little bit, that activity patch moves somewhat. Like that. And of course there is ambiguity. If the angle is about 45 degrees from directly behind, you have exactly the same time delay as if it were 45 degrees here. That's why I said you only measure really the angle relative to this line here, and it doesn't matter which way around it goes, whether it's to forward or behind. You will need other types of information in order to work out that. One feature of a delay line system is the following. Look at the case where you've got the maximal delay. So here you have a neuron which fires most when delay is maximal. Here you have a neuron that fires most when delay is nearly maximal. Neurons that fire for this type of delay. Neuron that fires for almost no delay, and so on. So here, these neurons have their maximum firing rate within the range of delays that is actually possible given how far the ears are apart. And so that is a characteristic of a delay line system. When you look then in birds at this tuning curve, then you find then that these peaks are then within the range of delays that are actually possible. Like I said, given how far the ears are apart. And that, when you then look in the brain, you find a delay line system. You may notice that this delay line system looks a little bit different. That's because it's from the kind that you find, for example, in chickens. The owls have a slightly more sophisticated version. That's the one I presented to you. It turns out when you look at mammals, their peaks are actually well outside the range of possible delays. So here clearly that can't be a delay line system. What you have instead is that the firing rate for this neuron versus this neuron, these firing rates are more or less proportional to the angle. So here the direction is encoded by how much a neuron fires, while here it's encoded by which neuron fires. So birds and mammals have independently evolved a system for measuring interaural time delay, and those systems solve the problem in different ways. The same thing has been found also in South African and South American electric fish. They, again, some of the computations they have to make are exactly the same, but with electric organs having evolved independently, the areas of the brain that process the information have likewise evolved independently, and they have found slightly different ways of doing things. So in this case, actually the method is the same, but it's different areas of the brain that do the same job. So merely knowing that a brain is solving a particular task doesn't yet tell you how the brain solves it, because quite often there are different solutions to the same job. So if I come back to this, if I summarize, what we have is that the location here depends on how much of a head start the action potential from one side has. That, though, is for a frequency of sound with a pretty long wavelength. That's where things are nice and clear and unambiguous. What happens if we have a higher frequency with a shorter wavelength? Well, here is the same sound direction as before. We have the same delay here, but it turns out that we can get the same delay from a different sound angle if we have this higher frequency and shorter wavelength, because this delay, which corresponds to this distance that the wavefront must travel, corresponds to the time delay between the arrival of this wavefront on the right ear and the previous wavefront on the left ear. So that gives us again this activity patch. If we look at the time delay between the arrival of the same wavefront on the right and the left ear, that gives us a longer delay. That would give us a greater head start for this action potential. That might give us this activity patch. If we look at the time difference between the arrival of the previous wavefront here, or the 1-2 ahead, versus this here, then actually the left ear has a head start, or it looks like it, and we get here another patch. So now actually the whole system is ambiguous. You can see the same thing here in my simulation. So if I go to here, we see here 3 activity patches. And as I change the direction of the sound, these activity patches move in parallel. So they move together. Then if I look at a still higher frequency, I get still more activity patches, which again move together in tandem, but they are ambiguous. So which of these possible angles is actually the correct one? One thing that may be clear here is that the higher the frequency, the more patches we get. And in the barn owl, we have multiple delay lines. Each delay line responds to different frequencies. And these are systematically ordered such that in one direction you get frequency and in the other direction you get delay. So frequency and delay are mapped roughly perpendicular to each other. And because they're mapped onto the surface of the brain, these computational parameters, this is called a computational map. So if you want to read more about that kind of thing, that is the key search term you should put into the scientific database or Google Scholar. If I now, so here in this case, I look only at 3 delay lines and I put in the action potentials. If I now don't show the action potentials and I only show the activity patches, and I show them for all the other delay lines with all the other frequencies in between, what I should get is down here I should have a single patch, and then the higher up I go in frequency, the more activity patches I should have for a delay line. So what I should get is something that looks like this. So here a single patch, and as I go up in frequency I get more and more activity patches for each delay line. So delay lines run horizontally, frequency runs vertically. The other thing I have shown here is that actually the activity patch, we must expect that it's broader at low frequencies. And the reason is quite simply that if you think about this movement of the cilia, if the wavelength is long, that wavefront is not going to be all that crisp. It's going to be a relatively slow movement of those cilia in that relevant part of the cochlea. Therefore, there is more variation in the timing of the action potential. You might even have several action potentials while the cilia are bent one way, while if the frequency is small, there is a narrower time window in which action potentials can be generated. So we should expect then that the timing here for the high frequencies is somewhat more precise but ambiguous. Down here it's less precise but unambiguous. So we have this trade-off between ambiguity versus precision. If I now look at what happens to this pattern of activity as I shift the sound around, as I move it around my owl's head, then I should get movement like this. So if the sound moves to the right, then signals from the right ear have a head start and the whole pattern moves to the left. And the further the sound comes from the right, the more the pattern moves to the left. So now here what was originally in the center has moved all the way to the left. So that is a maximum you can get. Then if the sound goes further around, then the pattern moves back to the center again, moves all the way to the right when the sound comes directly from the left, then moves back here again. One question then is, how can you use that information to determine the direction? So we've said this here is ambiguous, this here is clear but not very precise. It is possible to combine all this information and look at it all at the same time, because if you just look at this computational map, then you can tell when the pattern is centered, when the pattern is all on one side or on the other side. But if we rely on pattern recognition, then in a sense we're saying there is a homunculus in there. Something weird and wonderful happens here that we haven't explained. So something magical is going on. That doesn't explain how the brain uses this computational map. So we haven't really solved the problem until we have a way of reading the computational map. Fortunately, there is a simple way of doing that. It has to be simple, because as long as you have something where you say that is intelligent, then you've got something hidden in there that you haven't explained. You have to break it down into individually stupid steps. The whole thing might be, well, if you're lucky, it will produce interesting behavior that you might describe as intelligent, but until you have broken each of the individual steps down into things that are individually stupid, you haven't gotten an explanation. You have still something magical in there. And it turns out there is a simple and elegant way of reading a pattern like this. The principle, if I go back to where I was, is as follows. This here is a three-dimensional display of this same pattern here from the program. So here we have the low frequencies with their broad peaks, that is down here. Here we have the high frequencies with multiple sharp peaks. That's this bit up here. If the sound moves, that whole pattern moves. So you can see as the sound here turns further and further to the right, this whole pattern here moves further and further to the left. So that's the same thing I've just shown you in the simulation. If I now go on, one thing you can do is apply the Hebbian learning rule, which briefly says things that fire together wire together. So basically I say I now want a neuron that learns this pattern here. So I have a neuron here and I say connect to all the things that are maximally active, or possibly connect to all the neurons in proportion to their activity, and I show here only the maximally active neurons. So if I were looking down at the computational map from the top, that pattern would look like this. It would reproduce the activity pattern. So whatever activity pattern I have here, I reproduce in a connection pattern. So if I look here at connection pattern 1, I haven't got anything. But my input looks like that. So if I now say that this input is something that I want to recognize, I now give a command for my model network to learn, and it reproduces the input pattern. So now the actual input pattern and the connection patterns are the same. But when I move the sound, the connection pattern, of course, doesn't react to this because it has been trained once. The input pattern obviously does react to it. So then I can use a different input pattern and I can again give the command to learn it. So now I say these things here are maximally active, and I make connections to this. So I make a second neuron that connects to whatever is active when I have this different input pattern. So let's say I have sound all the way from the right, and now I tell it, so here let's look at connection pattern 2, doesn't exist. I give the command to learn, it reproduces that input pattern, and now that input pattern doesn't change, sorry, the connection pattern doesn't change when the input does. Now, how can I use this information? What now happens effectively is that whatever my, oops, what have I done now? I think I taught it. Oh yes, I've just let's do that again. So okay. So here I have my connection pattern, and what I now can look at is how do I use that? And what happens is that when connection and input are the same, then I should get maximal output. And I can look at that. I can look at the pattern 1 output, which is multiplying the input with the output pattern. So that is why this here is slightly sharper. So I take the input pattern, I multiply it with the connection pattern, which is the same, so I get the square, which means that I get slightly sharper lines here. So when I look at the output, it looks like this. So let's define that, which is a maximal output, as 1. If I now move the direction of the sound, so let's move the direction of the sound like this, then of course it no longer matches the connection pattern. If I look at the output, that changes like that. So here is the sum of all the outputs. Here is the activity of each coincidence detector in the delay lines. And you find that much of the time, so especially here where you have broad peaks, there is still quite a lot of activity. Here there's quite a bit of overlap, but we get a sharp peak only at this point. Now, that is for a sound like that. If we look at pattern 2 output, that was the pattern which is for a sound all the way from the right, so the pattern has moved all the way to the left. So if I now look at the output, the sound is here, so not a lot going on. I move the sound to here, all the way on the other side. We get the occasional bits of coincidence between this here, between the input pattern and the connection pattern. So wherever these cross over, of course, we still have outputs like that. But the sum of all these outputs is not so very much. Right? So if I go all the way to the other side, where input and connection patterns are the same, that's where I get the maximum. So now it turns out I can recognize this sound again. So I can recognize the same sound direction. Once I have set this up, once I've had that learning, I can use this pattern to determine the direction of a sound. So I do that with a whole series of neurons. That now gives me, at the next stage of processing, gives me the sound direction. Now, if you look at the output of those next stage neurons, it actually depends what kind of tone you give them, what kind of input. And that is because of the following. Let's look at the coincidence detectors again. Here we have a broadband sound with all the sound frequencies present. What would happen if we gave it only a narrowband sound? So the figure starts off with only a pure tone. Let's give it just mostly the high frequencies, so the top 20% of the frequency band. Oh, sorry, it starts off with the bottom frequency. So now, if I move the input pattern, I get this. The upper bit I don't see because this is now low frequency sound. So mostly I've got this broad pattern here. If I now look at pattern to output, so actually what I still get is reasonable match here. It's just that the output here is fairly low because one thing I haven't introduced here is a normalization which looks at what is the maximum it can get at any one point, which basically takes into account that I haven't got those inputs. I haven't added that to the program. But basically what you would see then here in the pattern to output, here you can see, so if you just look at the amount of white there is, here it's a fair bit. As I move this, then it tends to get less. If I move to here, again, so I get different patterns, and especially if I move to this here, what you then find is that many of the sound directions actually fit the pattern right at the top. So then at that point what you would get, if I had done the normalization here correctly, is you have many peaks here which are all about equally strong, because after all, here at the top, these two patterns are identical. So if we give that system, if we give that computational map only the high frequencies, then at this point, both the output neuron with the orange connections and the output neuron with the blue connections, because only that party is active, then they would give exactly the same output. So at that point, the whole thing is ambiguous. Also, if I move the sound, then this blue neuron will also respond when this whole pattern moves to here. It will respond when the whole pattern moves to here, and so on. So that is why then I get this kind of response where there are multiple peaks at about equal spacing as far as delays are concerned. So if you look at the interaural time difference, you will have multiple peaks here. If though I increase the bandwidth, the whole thing gets better. So it becomes slightly less ambiguous as bandwidth increases. So now it starts counting again. So you can see that. So let's look from here. Here we have a maximum. Then here we have another maximum. So it's slightly less picky, but this here is, well, it's slightly higher than that here. It's higher than these here. And as we go across here, it moves a bit, but mostly it has one major peak. If we go to pattern 1, that had its maximum here, roughly. So we have something here. Then we have another peak here and smaller ones here. Right. So, and we go to this bit here, then it gets better still. So the original location is pretty good, and then we have minor peaks. So that's original location again here at the back. Then we have minor peaks elsewhere. So So as we increase the bandwidth of the sound, as we have a broader range of frequencies, one particular delay becomes more and more dominant in the response, and these peaks here will be less. So if we now have one neuron here that responds a lot, then other neurons will respond less because they might have their big peak here and minor peaks here. So at this next level, basically, we can get a reasonably good estimate of the sound source. So if I now look at how this all is put together, we get information from each cochlear nucleus, we get a calculation of interaural intensity difference here in this bit of the brain, the lateral lemniscus, we get interaural time difference in the nucleus laminaris, the computation in here in the inferior colliculus, that gets combined to an auditory coordinate. So where you use interaural time delay for more or less horizontal angle, this here at high frequencies for the vertical angle, you basically combine the two, you get some location in auditory space. Then at the next level, that gets combined with other information, primarily visual. So at each stage, more information is added in. That is a fairly general pattern. So down here, you have very special purpose computations. One thing is that this computation here simply can't afford to have anything to do with amplitude, because if it did, what would happen is, let's say you set the threshold so that only the very loudest sounds produce any action potentials at all. Then as soon as sound intensity goes down, you wouldn't have any inputs to your delay lines, you wouldn't have any pattern. If, on the other hand, you had the whole thing set up so that it responds to any sound at all, then you might have action potentials at any time, and then again you lose the pattern. So then everything would be white instead of everything black in this display here. That means that the system that calculates time differences must not have any input about intensity, even though the time differences are about the location of sound, and intensity differences are also interesting for the location of sound, but the time and the intensity have to be kept separate because they would interfere with each other. So at this very early stage of processing, you have these very special purpose modules, as Fodor calls them, which have a specialized computation, which use only a specialized set of information, a very restricted set of information. They work very quickly and efficiently. One aspect of efficiency actually is related to the idea of a phase space. So the idea is, well, actually in the computational map, we've effectively, this here is the phase space, because basically it's the possible of the space of all possible computational values. The computational values we have are delay and frequency. So these are all mapped in here, and we have only those two parameters, so we have a two-dimensional space. And these very modular systems, now Fodor, as far as I remember, didn't state it in quite those terms, but it's implied by his definitions of a special purpose computation carried out on a very specialized set of information. So you have a fairly limited phase space. You know in advance what that phase space will be. So you know in advance what delays are possible, simply from the spacing of the ears and from the speed of sound. you know in advance what frequencies this ear can hear. So the whole phase space is given, and the other thing you can see is when you give this system a broadband sound, then actually a good proportion of those neurons are active at any one time. As you get to the more abstract spaces, like where in head coordinates is that sound, as long as you only have a single sound, that will then be just one reasonably precise spot, which is basically in somewhere in that spherical coordinate. That one spot then will make up a much smaller proportion of that phase space. So basically that next phase space of the auditory space is basically the elevation, how far up and down, and the azimuth, how far right or left. And as these what is represented gets more abstract, what tends to happen is that the input you're dealing with at the moment will occupy a smaller proportion of the phase space, which means that the larger proportion of your neurons sit idle and do nothing at the moment. That would eventually get quite inefficient, and so as you get to these later computations, actually the brain seems to use a few computational tricks in order to reuse neurons so that each neuron actually works in several different situations. That is more efficient because brains, after all, are metabolically very expensive and don't grow any larger than they need to, as Jerison said. But that makes it more complicated to analyze what's going on. So you don't find these nice and tidy computational maps, at least they're not obvious, even though, at least in some cases, people argue that you've got a sort of hidden computational map, that the whole process works effectively as I've described here. It just is less obvious. Another point I want to make here is that there is no single neuron in this computational map that tells you where the sound comes from. The input information also, it's not a single value. The single value is what you want to get out of it. What you get in is a pattern of input. You process or remember it with a pattern of connections. You then combine the input and the pattern of connections, and then you summarize that. In this case, you detect that pattern again. You find a way of detecting that pattern, and that recognition is passed on to the next stage, where then you have higher order patterns, you have more complex patterns. But the important thing here is the information is distributed. So the input is a pattern. The information is distributed over a whole input pattern. The processing is distributed over a pattern of connections. That's why one branch of artificial intelligence calls these simple neural networks parallel distributed processing. Distributed because the information is in patterns, parallel because these neurons don't wait for each other. So if I go back to the individual delay lines, like here, these coincidence detectors, that one here is not asking any of the other coincidence detectors what it's doing. These things are just working in parallel. So much of the time, many of the neurons in the brain work in parallel, and at any one point, most of the neurons are independent from each other. So you obviously have connections in between them. You have sometimes within a layer, sometimes as processing proceeds through its various stages. So there you get dependencies, but at any one moment, most of the neurons are independent from most of the other neurons, so the processing proceeds in parallel. So If you understand this, and also the second part of the Introduction to Computational Neuroscience, you probably know more about how brains function and process information than 99.99% of the population. However, what I can teach you here is, well, it relates to how brains work, roughly as addition and subtraction relate to the whole of mathematics. So even though you know more than the vast majority of the population, once you understand this, compared to the whole of neuroscience and compared to understanding how brains work, it's barely the beginnings. I just want to give you a taster so that you understand the basic principles, because this here is part of the basics, just like addition and subtraction are part of the basics of mathematics.